So I'm pleased to be joined today for this spotlight on value-centred leadership and stakeholder expectations by Lord Mark Sedwill. Welcome, Mark.
Well, thank you. Good to be with you.
So you've been involved with Windsor Leadership since 2016 and you're part of the Windsor Leadership alumni community. More recently, we've been delighted to welcome you as a chair and speaker on some of our programmes. And we're delighted today that you're going to be speaking for our September workshop on value-centred leadership. So for those who may not know you, please provide us with a very quick 30-second flavour of your background.
Well, I'm a British diplomat. Spent most of my career in the Middle East and South Asia. Ended up as ambassador and NATO representative in Afghanistan, and thereafter became permanent secretary at the Home Office, national security advisor and cabinet secretary. Retired from that almost 4 years ago, and now have a series of commercial and charitable interests, as well as being a member of the House of Lords.
So Mark, a strong set of personal values can be instrumental in our approach to stakeholder management. Who helped you shape your personal values, and how in turn have they shaped your leadership?
I think they're shaped over time, Liz. So I wouldn't say there was a moment at which I could say that was my personal values crystallized and firm, and then I just applied them thereafter. And I think mine were really shaped throughout my career as a diplomat. So you go to other countries. I served, as I said, in Middle East and South Asia. So very different cultures, different value systems, some overlaps, but some differences. And I think one of the things I learned particularly on my first posting in Egypt, but every posting since, up to and including Afghanistan and then running the Home Office, is actually seeing the world through other people's eyes. And so my values, I think, were shaped by experiences of that kind throughout my career, and just understanding that one has to be quite humble about this and not assume that we have a universal set of values that we define that everyone else will necessarily see in the same light. Although, as I say, most are common. I mean, just putting it in a slightly more light-hearted way, when I left, my private office gave me drinks mats, which had "Be excellent to each other" on it, because one of the things I used to quote was a great sort of comedy movie from the 1990s, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. And I used to say, like Bill and Ted used to say, "Be excellent to each other." And so they remembered that, and that was part of my farewell gift. So you might say my personal values arose from Bill and Ted.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much. And thank you to Bill and Ted. So our next question is around managing balance. With so many conflicting demands and expectations, perhaps especially during your tenure at the Home Office and then the Cabinet Office, how did you manage to balance the needs of multiple stakeholder groups?
I think you have to understand all of their needs and perspectives to start with. And that, again, means listening really hard and not simply assuming that you know what the answer is, or back to this point about understanding that people come to things with different perspectives and different values. So you have to listen really hard to start with. But fundamentally, in the end, you have to try and just do what you think is the right thing. Now, of course, one is supporting ministers as a civil servant, one's supporting ministers. But I was really conscious, particularly at the Home Office, when we were dealing with some acute issues, that it was important to provide some sort of moral leadership to the Home Office community as well, particularly when we faced some of these most challenging circumstances, and being ready just to do the right thing, even if that meant embarrassment or difficulties for us. And I faced a series of dilemmas of that kind. But it starts with listening.
Great, that's helpful. Thank you.
So you've been in positions of considerable power and influence, juggling constantly shifting demands, as many of our leaders do, and have been influential in making some really tough decisions. What's been your plumb line through it all?
I mean, one thing you have to remember as a civil servant is, in the end, we don't have a democratic mandate, ministers do. And so the plumb line there is, and I think you come on to a question later about how do you deal with situations where you don't really agree with the outcome. Well, that's part of the professional obligation. We are there to support people who have a democratic mandate, and we don't. And so that's the absolute core of it. But then fundamentally, particularly in a diplomatic career, one tries to take a view of the long-term national interest. And that means reconciling security and prosperity and influence and values and so on. And I was sometimes known as sort of the ultra-realist, that actually, I took a rather sort of calculated view, dispassionate view of what I thought was the national interest in advising ministers, rather than saying, well, on principle, we should do X, Y, and Z, but actually saying, well, actually, here is where I think our interests lie. And I felt that was part of my job, because I felt that ministers could bring the values perspective, and of course, politicians have different value sets as well within democratic systems, and will care deeply about those issues. But actually, what they needed from the professionals was a dispassionate analysis of where the national interest lie. And so that's what I always tried to do. I think the other thing one has to remember in thinking about values is we have the luxury in a Western democracy where the rule of law applies, of being able to think these things through and apply our values and know that they will be respected. We sometimes forget that circumstances, in the case of civil wars, for example, in Afghanistan or elsewhere, put people who are not evil people, they're not bad people in themselves. I mean, there are people of that kind, but they put them in almost impossible circumstances where, to protect their family, their tribe, the group they represent, they have to do some terrible things. And we need to be careful not to be too judgmental from the luxury of not facing those choices. We've had to face those choices in the past. Churchill's decision to allow the bombing of Coventry to go ahead in order to protect the Enigma secret during the Second World War was an example of some of the invidious choices you sometimes have to make. And I think we have to be very respectful of that when we're dealing with people in circumstances that, at least in modern times, we haven't had to face.
A fascinating piece to sort of understand those really tricky decisions that are made. It's not necessarily illegal to do the thing, but it stands at complete odds with your own personal value system.
Yeah.
Any examples that you can sort of draw out from your own experience?
Well, I think of examples where I know other people face that. Actually, I never did, because I was really clear about it. And as I said, I think I was known as the sort of the ultra realist. I was very conscious of those choices, but that's how I reconciled myself to them. That leadership under in these very difficult situations, and particularly in war or civil war, or the kind of campaigns we were involved in the post 9/11 era, involved invidious choices, and you had to make what you believed was the right choice for the greater good. You didn't have the choice of doing the right thing or the wrong thing. The choices were really challenging choices in order to try and protect the greater good, if you like. And I have no moral problem with that. Life isn't easy. You don't just get to choose the right thing or the wrong thing. And if you want to do that, as Harry Truman said, you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. You go find something else to do. And so I never had any ethical difficulty with that, even though the decisions themselves were really hard and in some cases very painful.
In the dynamic environments you've worked in, where goalposts have been constantly shifting, how did you personally manage to keep your head above water in the midst of it all?
I think actually just personal resilience is really important in those circumstances. I mean, actually shifting goalposts and fluidity and pressure, I kind of thrive on. I enjoy the leadership, the intellectual, the emotional challenge of dealing with those very fluid situations. And I've never found that stressful. It's pressured, but it isn't stressful for me, because that's part of the buzz. That's part of the adrenaline fix, I guess. I am a bit of an adrenaline junkie, and it's a part of the adrenaline fix one gets from the job. But I think you have to be really thoughtful about your personal resilience, and as a leader, you have to be really conscious about how you give everyone else permission around you, who might find those things harder, for example, in some cases, to be conscious of their personal resilience as well. And so one of the things I was always really conscious of doing, actually particularly under pressure, was remaining calm. People will say about me it was completely unflappable. Well, it didn't feel like that quite often, but I had to remain calm. I had to project calm in order that everyone else stayed calm. And you know from the neuroscience, of course, that means people are more intelligent in the moment, more likely to make the right decisions, etc. And so I found that really, really important. And part of the personal resilience was just having, away from the crisis moments, a good work-life balance, getting away from it, not having having a sort of detached personal life from the professional life. So my friends, I was once criticised in a newspaper article, I think, saying, "Oh, he's not like his predecessor who likes spending time with journalists and politicians. He likes spending his time with soldiers and spooks and farmers." And the answer was, yeah, I do. And getting away to the countryside and just spending time outside and playing sport and doing other things. That's how I maintain my personal resilience, and then could bring essentially the best of myself to the circumstances I found myself in.
That's really useful, actually, because I think many people struggle, working weekends and not having that sort of division between the home life and the work life. And in fact, it's more about life balance now, isn't it, rather than life work balance, particularly for the many people like yourself, myself, who work from home a large percentage of the time. There is still, there used to be that division. You used to drive or get the train into work, and there would be that separation between work and home. And now, when it's often in the living room for some people, or in a separate room in the house, that there is that sort of constant reminder of work, and there is also that constant ability to check on the old mobile phone. Did you ever have a BlackBerry in the days?
So I did have a BlackBerry throughout, certainly throughout my time. I think it was at the Home Office I had one. I think by the time I got to the Cabinet's office, we'd moved on to iPhones and so on, but the same sort of thing. But I had I was fortunate in my last decade or so when I was in leadership positions. I was able to impose some discipline on that. So my private office knew and transmitted out, for example, at the Home Office to the organisation, that I was completely intolerant of things being urgent just because people hadn't done them in time. There are things that are genuinely urgent, crises arise, but it's not urgent just because someone spent all week on something and then dump it into my inbox on Friday and then tell me I've got to make a decision by Friday evening or Sunday evening or whatever. And so after a while of being pretty fierce about that, people realize, no, okay, if it's urgent, it's got to be urgent. And so my private office knew that if they were to disturb me at the weekend, they'd need to phone, not just, I might have a look at BlackBerry, I might have a look at the emails, but there's no guarantee that I would until I got on the train on the Monday morning, coming up from my home in the countryside, when I had 2 hours clear. I had 2 hours clear on a Friday, 2 hours clear on a Monday. That's half a day just to sort of get through emails and all the rest of it. So that was my sort of box time, if you like. And therefore, people, my private office knew if there was something genuinely urgent, they had to phone me. That naturally raises the threshold of just, than just pinging a text or pinging an email. And it had to be genuinely urgent. And so as a result, I reckon in my years at the Home Office, Cabinet Office, etc., I mean, up until the very last period with COVID, when, of course, it was just, completely exceptional. But really, throughout that period, certainly as at the Home Office and as National Security Advisor, I probably only had about half a dozen weekends completely wrecked by work throughout that time. You do a bit, make a call, whatever, but genuinely wrecked by work, probably only that, because I just imposed some discipline on. And again, by doing that, it was not only contributing to my personal resilience, I was transmitting around the organisation as the boss that other people didn't have to work 24/7 either.
Excellent. That's really helpful. And I think for many people who are struggling with the same thing, actually providing that framework, not just for yourself, but for those who are working to you, I think is really, really important, isn't it? Yeah. And the permission piece, actually giving people permission to enjoy their weekends and to not have to, struggle through and work through them.
One of my senior guys, who just had a habit of, his working pattern was to work till 1 o'clock in the morning and ping emails around. And so his staff sort of felt the need, it would ping in their BlackBerry, probably wake them up, and they'd feel the need to respond. And I said to him, you've just got to stop this. You put them in drafts, wake up at whatever time you wake up, and just send all of them at 7 o'clock in the morning. That's fine. But you've got to stop this behavior where you're imposing your working practice on everyone else.
And that's interesting, because I do know people, particularly in the corporate, the commercial setting, where there is almost an expectation that you are paid a certain amount of money, so you will be available when we need you. And it's almost that sort of, right, you've got to respond within 20 minutes, half an hour of receiving a message.
I think there are, that's right, Liz, but I think there are circumstances in which that is necessary. And so we would find that. We had time differences, for example, with New York, 5-hour time difference. And so the Security Council would be meeting on something really serious, and we would need a decision at 2 o'clock in the morning, UK time. When I was a private secretary to the foreign secretary, so I'd get a call from, if I was the duty private secretary, I'd get a call from the ambassador, and he'd say, look, we need a decision. And if we hadn't been able to get that from the foreign secretary because we didn't quite know how it was going to turn out, or the prime minister even, by say 10 o'clock in the evening, there were times we had to disturb him. So of course, in big jobs, pressure situations, there are times you have to do that, but it should be the exception. And so if you get a ping at 2 o'clock in the morning, it should be, okay, this is for real. It's not just because someone happens to have an inconsiderate working pattern. And then you don't mind. You don't mind losing a night's sleep because there's something really important happening. You do mind losing a night's sleep just because someone has this false sense of machismo about being on all the time and never respond, never relaxing, and all the rest of it.
Super, that's helpful, thank you. And how did you empower your staff to recognise their personal values and tap into them for the benefit of the organisation?
Well, in a sense, that slightly flippant answer I gave you earlier, that Bill and Ted be excellent to each other, is part of that. So I think what you have to try to do as the leader, and frankly, I didn't always get this right. There are times you just have to, things are moving quickly, you're in the chair, you just have to be on transmit and expect people just to get on with it. And understand that you don't really have time for an awful lot of input in those circumstances. But if that shouldn't be the norm, and you earn the right to do that, I think, by having quite a collaborative, sort of collegiate approach beforehand, and allow people, as you're threshing through issues, not just to bring their professional advice, but their personal values to the table, and not close that down. So even if I would say, well, actually, look, in the end, X, Y is for the politicians to decide. I did have many circumstances in which people were really wrestling with some of the dilemmas that we face, and whether it was right or not to do something. And I don't think you should close that down. I think you have to accept we are dealing with human beings after all. You want the whole person to be bringing themselves into the decision-making process, and in particular the decision implementation process. And I think part of the deal is to say, once a decision is taken, it's taken, debate over, get on with it. It's not a student debating society where you just keep going. Decision taken, get on with it now. But the deal has to be, in reaching the decision, you allow people to bring their whole selves, bring their professional experience, but also their personal value system to it, and then say, okay, either I or a minister or whatever, whoever it might be, has taken a decision now. The wider value system, which is they have the democratic mandate, they get to decide, or I get to decide on the behalf of whatever it is. Now get on with it and stop the argument. I think that's the deal, and that's how you do it. I think by far the hardest issue I ever had to deal with was the aftermath of the Jimmy Savile child sex abuse scandal, and then the public panic about establishment child sex abuse, a lot of which was untrue, but of course some of which turned out appallingly to be true. And I think the thing I found hardest throughout that was to maintain professional detachment. I was expected as the permanent secretary of the Home Office, and I've talked a lot about being quite realistic, being quite dispassionate, being able to detach myself. But I found that incredibly hard in that case, because every time the issue came up, my initial reaction was as a father. And I was just so angry, because I would immediately just pop into my head, what if this happened to, you know, my family or to the children of people I knew?
Sure.
And you just couldn't, to remain professionally attached was really, really hard. And I just had to sort of allow that moment to pass. And I remember being told by donkey's years before, actually, and not on an issue like this, by Jackie Smith, who was Home Secretary probably a decade or so beforehand, who said something very wise, which was, your initial reaction, which will be the emotional reaction to anything hard, is the same reaction as every other citizen will have. The difference is, as professionals, you'll then move on to something, you know, to your professional response. The rest of the public won't. They'll still be on where you were. And so don't lose the initial emotional response. Don't lose your connection to that, because that will remind you of where everyone else is. And you mustn't be so dispassionate, so professional, that you somehow you come across as uncaring, because you've moved on, you've managed to force yourself as a professional to move on from that initial response. But I found that phenomenally hard in that case. I think that advice from Jackie Smith is a really good piece of advice for people in high pressure jobs. Your initial reaction is probably the same as everyone else's, and everyone else's will stay there, even if you are then able to take a step back and widen your perspective.
Mark, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you today, and we very much look forward to hearing more from you as a speaker at the workshop in September. Thank you so much.
Look forward to it. Thanks, Liz.